And welcome back. As we go ahead and get ready to add a little bit more to our game, we need to first, of course, get ready to add in another piece of information for our coding experience, which is that of a while loop. So let's go ahead and just, before we do this, take a quick review of some of the loops that we talked about. So the first, of course, are for loops. These are typically running for a set number of iterations, and these are ones where we have like int I equals some initial value, and it's going up to some value that we want to stop at, and we usually have some kind of incrementer that's controlled. So you might, for example, increase it by 1. Then we have for each loops. These don't keep track of iteration because instead what they're going to do is they're typically doing things like traversing a list. So they're going to start, for example, at the beginning of a list of objects, and they're going to go to the end of the list of objects and then do some action along the way. Then we have while loops, which are going to be something that we can actually use here in our code that we're going to need. These are really helpful because they can run as long as the Boolean condition is true. Now you can technically do this with for loops as well, but it's definitely a lot easier setup to do this with a while loop. Similarly, we can also use what's known as a do while loop. And a do while loop has an extra advantage in that you can guarantee that that loop is going to execute at least once before it checks that Boolean condition and then repeats until false. So the while and do while are very similar, and we're going to actually use those here in our code to actually add a little bit more functionality for our player and enemy. So what we're going to want to do is go ahead and think about how we want our enemies to continuously spawn. And so right now we of course have set up wave 1 and wave 0, but what if we want those waves to repeat? Well, the way we can handle that is actually by first starting off by creating another serialized field here that's going to allow us to create a bool type, and we'll call this is looping. And because maybe we don't want those enemies to loop, maybe we only want a static number of waves, and this can be a way to help us control that. And what we actually want to do is probably actually come down here to our spawning generation, because we already have this in some type of loop, so we actually could probably take this whole thing and put that inside of another loop. And so I'm going to leave you with a quick micro challenge. I'm going to give you a hint though. We want you to go ahead and take this code and put it inside of a loop. Now the thing we're probably going to want to do, because we're looking at infinite number of waves here potentially, is we're probably going to want to use a while loop or a do while loop. And so I'm just going to have you think about it. Go ahead and pause the video for a second and think about how you might try to implement this chunk of code inside of that loop. All right, and so let's go ahead and take a look at how we can implement this. So what I'm going to do is actually do a do while loop here. I could do this with a while loop, but I want to guarantee that I have at least one iteration of these enemy waves coming out. And because I want to guarantee at least one, no matter what, I'm probably going to want to use that do while. So we're just going to say do, and then we'll just go ahead and do some open close parentheses here at end, or excuse me, not parentheses, but curly brackets. And I'm just going to go ahead and take this code that I previously have. I'm going to cut that and paste it inside of the do part here. And underneath this, I'm going to do my while. Now, what should go in that while is a Boolean condition. And if you remember, we just created a new bool that can determine whether or not we want these to be a repeating set of enemies. And that is looping. And so I'm just going to go ahead and put that there, and we're actually going to put a semicolon here. It's a little different syntax than you might expect because our curly brackets actually here belong to the do part, and the while is looping is actually going to end up with a semicolon. So a little different than we might expect normally with some of our loops, but that is just the way the do while loop syntax is set up. Now with that little bit of code added, we can see we now have this option here for is looping. And let's just go ahead and see what that looks like for our purposes. I'm going to speed the time up between waves. Let's make that 0 so they immediately come right in. And so of course we have 2 waves right now. So if I go ahead and let this run, here comes wave number 1 and here comes wave number 2. Alright, so that looks pretty great. But what happens now if I were to rerun this, but with the is looping flag on? So now when I run this, here comes my first wave spawning on in. You can see 1, 2, 3. Here comes the second one right behind them. 1, 2, 3. And immediately we have the next wave coming right behind them. And notice it will just keep coming forever until, of course, we either uncheck this looping flag or we stop our game. So this is a way for us to have an infinite number of enemies keep spawning into our world. Now, of course, there may be a moment where you don't want this to happen. Maybe you only want a set number. And you could, of course, cap that. You can manipulate, for example, the code. Maybe you want to have a cap of 100 enemies no matter what. You could do those sort of things, but this I think is a pretty good step for getting started with this player here. But the next thing we're probably going to want to do is start adding some health into both our player and our enemies to determine whether or not if we can hit them and whether or not it's going to trigger things like game over.